Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad that you're all here. I imagine we'll have some folks joining us slowly over time. My name is Janice Whitlock, and I'm the Associate Director for Teaching and Training for the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research. Today, you've joined us for the workshop, How to Collect and Analyze Focus Group Data, that will be presented by BCTR staff Jane Powers and Mandy Purington. Today's workshop is part of our series, How to Do Research in Real-World Settings, a core extension of the BCTR's mission to expand, strengthen, and speed connections between research, policy, and practice in service of human development and well-being. Before I introduce our speakers and turn it over to them, I just want to cover a few quick presentation logistics. I know we're all Zoom masters at this point, but just a few small things that you should know. We're using the Zoom meeting feature to allow for maximum interactions. So we would ask that you all please mute yourselves so that you can easily unmute if you want to ask questions or participate in other ways. To allow you to see just the speaker and the presentation, we encourage you to select side-by-side speaker in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom window. If you have challenges finding that, please just reach out in chat and one of us will help you. There are some workshop materials that you were emailed ahead of time and are now in a Google Drive folder. The link will be in the chat box, or just showed up in the chat box. You can find those there. And please note that this is being recorded. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Let me first introduce Jane. Jane is a BCTR-based researcher with a very long Cornell history. She is project director for Assets Coming Together, Act for Youth. It's a center for community action, which connects youth development research to practice, provides training and technical support, evaluation assistance, and resources to communities and youth serving programs across New York State. Jane has deep expertise in a variety of areas related to positive youth development and program evaluation, and uses mixed methods, including focus groups, quite often. Amanda Purington is the Director of Evaluation and Research for the Act for Youth project within the BCTR. She also studies communication as a PhD student within the social media lab here at Cornell. Professionally and academically, she's passionate about using research and evaluation to promote health and well-being of youth, and like Jane, has deep expertise in program evaluation, mixed methods research, and focus groups. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. Thank you all, and welcome Jane and Mandy.
Great. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Janice. This has been a popular topic. We have been doing this workshop quite a bit over the last couple of years, and we still get a following. So I guess there's still a need out there to learn about this method of focus groups. We've been doing focus groups for about 12 years, and we kind of got thrown into it, which I'll tell you about, and developed expertise along the way, made a lot of mistakes, and we'll point them out to you, and hopefully you can avoid them. But by way of background, ACT, as Janice said, is an intermediary organization. We've been funded since 2000 by the New York State Department of Health, and we support their grantees who work primarily in the area of adolescent health. We provide training, technical assistance, we do evaluation and research, we develop resources and disseminate them, basically to help practitioners and educators, people who are on the front lines of in the trenches working with youth, and we build their capacity to do their work more effectively. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our website, I encourage you to check us out. We have a rich treasure chest of resources on youth development, adolescent sexual health, implementing evidence-based programs, and many other topics. Anyhow, we started doing focus groups, as I said, about 12 years ago at the request of our funder, DOH, and they wanted to learn more about what youth in New York State thought about various topics, okay? Their interest in hearing from youth really grew out of this positive youth development movement in the late 90s. Positive youth development brought about a significant shift in how we view young people, a shift from a deficit model of like very problem focused, what's wrong with young people, how could we fix them, to viewing young people as assets, resources, contributors. And youth engagement was a fundamental tenet of the positive youth development movement. Focus groups provide a methodology, a way to obtain youth voice and hear the opinions, ideas, recommendations for how, to improve, for getting youth input, their ideas on ways that we can improve their programs and contribute to decisions about things that impacted their lives, particularly around their health. So DOH asked us to do a whole range of different focus groups on lots of topics. We've done a lot on adolescent sexual health. We've done them on family planning, health behavior, binge drinking, dating violence. And what has been especially gratifying about our focus group projects is that the findings have really been incorporated and used. They've been used to develop RFAs, programs, initiatives, and policies. And so that has been a direct application of our research. And as I said, it's been something that's been really positive for us. Anyhow, we want to just get a sense on, sadly, when we're doing these remotely, we don't know who's in the room. And it's kind of good to get a sense of who's there. We're not going to do a go around, don't worry. But we want to know what our sort of collective experience with focus groups in this room has been. So we are going to try to do a poll. We practiced this. Let's see if we could pull it off. So the first question is, have you ever participated in a focus group? Yes or no? And then submit it. Let's see how many people in this group have participated in a focus group. Okay, about a third of you have. All right. How about, have you ever, anybody in this room, conducted a focus group? Let's see what you have to say there. Let's see. Okay. Oh, well, that's interesting. So people have conducted focus groups, but they haven't been in them as a participant. That's an interesting finding. All right. Last question. Who in this room has ever analyzed qualitative data? I like that comment. Yes, I have led a focus group, but not well. I know we all feel like that at times. All right. Have you ever analyzed qualitative data? Let's see the collective experience in here. Wow. We have a lot of experienced data analyzers. That's great. Okay. So you all have been, it sounds like a lot of you have had some involvement with this world of qualitative data, and that's great. So, I mean, I want to just encourage you to ask questions along the way and not hold them. No question is too silly or simple or, I mean, it would be a lot more interesting to break this up and just not have us speaking at you. So please put your questions in the chat. Right? Is that how we're managing this, guys? Yeah, I think you put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring that to be able to answer your questions along the way. So this is where we're going. This is how we're going to be, the topics that we're going to be covering with our time with you this afternoon. And first of all, we're going to spend some time talking about, is focus group really the way you want to go? I mean, we learn this the hard way. Sometimes we were like way into a project of doing focus groups and we were like, you know what? Maybe a survey would have been better to get this information, or maybe we should have been doing interviews. And so you really need to spend some time making sure that this is that the focus group method is going to get you what you need, okay? Because it's a lot, it's resource intensive, it's time, it takes a lot of time. And so you really want to be sure it's the way to go. We're going to talk about planning your focus group, how to conduct it. We're going to give you some tools here, touch briefly about recording, managing your data, analyzing, reporting findings. I mean, we could spend an entire session on data analysis or data management and reporting. So this is kind of like breezing through these topics, but giving you resources along the way. I am going to touch briefly about conducting focus groups remotely in the virtual world. And while we have not done that yet, we're about to do a project doing virtual focus groups. So I have a couple of slides on that to share with you, as well as resources of articles that you could kind of follow up with. Again, if you have any burning questions about focus groups that you want us to discuss, please type them into the chat box so we can pay attention if we can. Okay. All right. So initially, focus groups have come out of industry and have been used extensively in market research to examine consumer behavior, product development, and more recently, they've become sort of popular in academic research to gather qualitative data. And it's sort of become a more legitimate method in social science research, very popular in participatory research, as well as international research. But it grew initially out of industry, and it really has become quite popular in the last few decades in the academy. The purpose of a focus group is to listen and to gather information and to find out what certain people think about an issue, a product, a service, and then look at the trends and patterns and perceptions. What's unique about a focus group is that the interaction that occurs is critical, and ideas that are generated by participants bounce off of each other. So it's a small group. It involves a small group discussion with people who possess certain characteristics. They could be teenagers living in rural communities. They are parents sending their children to kindergarten for the first time. They're seniors living in assisted living facilities. They are Cornell students, members of fraternities. They are pet owners taking their pets to the Cornell Vet School for treatment. And I'm not letting my golden retriever who wants to go out right now. So if you hear some crying, he's fine. And so you need to sort of identify what is that characteristic that that your participants possess, and that's being really important, and that they are guided by a trained leader to better understand a topic of interest to guide future action. Okay. That frequently that could be to improve a service, to create a program, to develop a media campaign. Okay, hold on one second. Sorry about that. I have a very demanding dog. Hopefully he'll stay outside for my time here. Okay. And as I said before, what's really special about the focus group is that respondents generate their own responses and then they build on the responses of others. And so it's that interaction that happens in the group that's important. So in contrast, why would we do an interview, which is a one-on-one conversation, also contains open-ended question, great for collecting qualitative data, and for deeply exploring topics, really unpacking people's feelings and ideas. But unlike a focus group, you can gather sensitive information in an interview. If you're needing sensitive information, focus groups is not the best way to go. If you need to, gather sensitive, highly confidential information, interviews are a better way to go. What you don't get in the interview is the ability for respondents to talk to each other and have their comments build on each other's comments. You don't get that group interaction. Surveys are good for collecting information about people's attributes, attitudes, and the advantage is that you can include a lot more people, collect information systematically, information that will have more statistical power with which to analyze your results. They serve a very different purpose than focus groups. Surveys assume that people know how they feel, but sometimes they really don't know. Sometimes it takes listening to the opinions of others in a small group and safe group setting before they form thoughts and opinions. So focus groups are well suited for those situations where I didn't really think about that. And you hear someone else say something, and then it just bounces off you, and you start forming your ideas and or think differently about something. So another thing about surveys is that the choices and categories are predetermined. Although there can be room for open-ended responses, mostly respondents are choosing from a list, and you can miss important data. So just let me give you an example of something. You could risk not having the right response category. So we've been doing a study on homeless youth for many years, and every couple of years we do follow-up studies. And we actually have homeless youth help us construct the survey. We always kind of revise the questions and make improvements. And we had a question on the survey was like, where do you go for when you're sick? And there were all these different categories. And then one year somebody, when we were revising the tool, said, well, I don't go anywhere when I'm sick. And we didn't have that as a category. So we put it in the survey. Well, a third of the respondents to the survey chose that. So, I mean, that was a really very important piece of information. But so surveys can miss things. Focus groups can actually help in survey development and generate response categories. You can identify what are the right questions to ask and the response options. And once you have that, you can use a survey to gather responses from a lot more people in a systematic way. So that could be a way that you could use focus groups in survey development. So basically, you want to use a focus group when you want to get a range of ideas, you want to understand differences in and perspective between groups or categories of people, and uncover factors that influence opinions and behavior and motivations. Ideally, participant comments will stimulate and influence the thinking and sharing of others. Some people may even change their thoughts and opinions during the focus group. Did I get bounced off? Hold on. Oh dear.
You're good, Jane.
Oh,
You're still here.
Oh my goodness, I got this phone call that just totally screwed me up. All right, I'm still there.
Yep, you're good.
Thank you. All right. So use a focus group when you're considering introducing a new program or service, or when you want to ask questions that can't easily be asked or answered on a written survey. And when you want to supplement the knowledge that you gain from written surveys. And we've done this recently, when you want to go deeper into what your survey has told you. So recently, we did a very large project for the health department on adolescent sexual health. And we started out with doing a survey where we collected probably 300 surveys from adolescents across the state. And then when we looked at the survey findings and we wanted to learn more, unpack some of those survey findings, we did a series of focus groups. And that was just a really wonderful approach to expand our knowledge. It was very, very successful. So this is just a little example of what we did. We wanted to know where adolescents go if they think they might have an STI or if they need birth control. And the survey findings showed that most of them went to a clinic or health center, but 63% went to a doctor's office. We were interested in this, and we thought, and when we ended up looking at it more closely, we saw that it was particularly, and we did focus group to unpack this, that it was our rural participants that were most likely to go to their doctor's office. And we got some quotes in the next slide. Parents are less suspicious about taking their kids to a doctor's appointment than a clinic. And at the doctor's office, they check everything. So we were able to really deepen our knowledge about this topic by doing a combined approach of both the survey and the focus groups. So don't use a focus group if you need consensus, if you're really wanting to educate people about a particular topic, if you need sensitive information collected, as I've said, if you really need to have statistical projections, if the topic is potentially, one of conflict and controversy, focus groups are not a great approach to use. and if confidentiality is a real issue. Now, one of the ground rules when you start the focus group is to establish confidentiality and how important that is. But this should be an issue when you're thinking about if focus groups are the most appropriate approach. So with that sort of background, we just wanted to get a sense of from you, what are your focus group topics? If you were to do a focus group, if you're considering one, what would the topic, what would you be looking at? So we're going to encourage you to chat in right now and take a couple of moments. Okay.
So we definitely have some very diverse topics coming in.
Anybody else? Pesticide use in suburban landscape management. Okay. Oh, Jackie. Hi, Jackie. What did you learn by participating in a Teens as Teachers project?
Hi, guys.
Hi. So you're thinking of doing a focus group project?
Maybe just reliving the experiences from the past.
Great.
Well, this morning I was contemplating a focus group topic on parents of teens and the ways that we can best support them through this difficult time. So kind of asking parents of older youth, so those who had already raised teenagers. I have a 13-year-old.
Awesome.
Great.
And then there's the parents of middle school youth that you're doing a project about also.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
who are learning virtually. So those challenges.
I need to ask Jim Nelson his potential project with computer mice and the interest in human-computer interface. Could you unmute yourself and tell us about that one?
Yeah, sure. So, well, we've developed a tool. It's really for gaming. So latency is a hugely important issue in gaming, like particularly these multiplayer games like PUBG and things like that. Probably your kids play them. And so we've developed a human-computer interface based off EMG signals that we pick up higher up in the arm. And so you actually click the mouse on the screen when you think it, not when you press the button on the mouse. And it cuts down the latency, basically.
So who would you be speaking to in this?
Gamers.
Okay.
16-year-olds, 24-year-olds.
I was going to say my 10-year-old might volunteer for that one too.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. It's kind of jaw-dropping when you see it working. We show people and they're like, what? It's kind of crazy. But.
Great. Well, so this is really interesting. I think just looking at the range of topics that everyone has mentioned, it makes me think about, I think this is a really great segue to some of what we're going to talk about next in terms of thinking about who you want to include in your group, the specific kinds of information that you want to be sure to get out of those focus groups. So I think we'll kind of jump into that section and just, thinking about how these apply to the topics that you've raised will hopefully be useful. So a good focus group requires lots of planning. There's definitely a lot more to it than just inviting a few key people to casually share opinions about a topic, as you all know. So these are just some kind of big things to keep in mind when you're developing your focus group study, and we'll kind of come back to some of these over the next several slides here. So first and foremost really is, what is your purpose? Why is it that you're doing this focus group? And part of that is kind of, what kinds of information do you want? So as Jane mentioned early on, a huge advantage of the focus group method is that interactivity between participants. So really keeping in mind, if you've decided the focus group is the way to go, what kinds of information are you really wanting to get? How does that interactivity between participants help you get that information? What types of information are important? How will you be using this information? Again, all speaking to that larger kind of study purpose. Another thing to keep in mind, and again, Jane touched on this, are ethical, social considerations. So depending on the nature of your topic, is this something that would be maybe difficult to talk about in a group setting? We do have some strategies for addressing sensitive topics in a group setting. But again, you want to think about this from the perspective of your participants. Might this be a difficult thing to talk about in a group? Are there other ethical considerations, legal considerations? We were talking about, some of our work with immigrant families and things along those lines. Are there maybe certain things that they wouldn't want to disclose, particularly in a group setting? So just being mindful of what the experience of answering some of these questions, particularly in a group setting, would be like. This bubble kind of in the middle around resources is an important one to consider. So resources, focus groups do take a lot of time, a lot of effort. It yields qualitative data, which can take quite a bit of effort and time to analyze, as I'm sure you're all aware. So just being really mindful of how that all fits into the bigger picture of planning for your focus group. When you start brainstorming about what questions you want to ask, there are some guidelines here. So the big frame helps you kind of think about what it is that you want to talk about in your focus group. You also want to think about the types of questions that you're asking here. So you want to keep your questions kind of clear and short. It's different from something that's written that someone is responding to, where they can maybe read and reread it to understand what the question is. Here, they're really just listening to it. So you want to make sure that they can pick up what you're really asking about pretty quickly, while they also are thinking about their response. You want to make sure that you're using words that are familiar to your participants. For example, we do a lot of focus groups with young people. We were doing a series on a topic called preconception health, which is not a term that even most adults would really say that they understand what that means. And so we had to really kind of like reframe that topic so that we could talk with young people about those concepts and issues. You want to make sure that the questions you're asking are going to really evoke conversation. So you want to make sure that they're open-ended. This is definitely one of the main benefits, is kind of evoking this conversation. So you don't want yes/no questions. During your question development phase, if you find that you have written yes/no questions, it can often be easily rephrased to kind of open it up. So for example, if you have brainstormed a question, does your community have programs for people struggling with food security? You could reframe that from does your community have, which is a yes, no, to how does your community support people struggling with food security? So during the brainstorming phase, we just kind of like throw everything out there and then, rework questions as we as we need to. You do want to make sure that the questions are focused and one-dimensional. So for example, one study question we had was about where young people get their information about sexual health and whether or not they trust these sources. But we asked those very, very deliberately as different questions. So the first question asked, where do you get information about sexual health? And we kind of jotted down what their responses were to that. We followed that up with some prompts for places that we thought that they might get sexual health information to see if that was or was not the case. And then for each of the categories, places that they said that they did get sexual health information, we asked, how much do you trust this as a source of information? So just kind of splitting things up a bit to make sure that we're not overwhelming our participants or really asking them to address too many topics, too many issues at the same time. As we kind of talked about before, you also want to consider what it would be like to answer these questions in a group setting from the perspective of your participants. We don't want the questions themselves to be threatening or embarrassing. We often talk about kind of more sensitive topics with adolescents a lot, as Jane said, around adolescent sexual health issues. And so one way that we have approached this is to not ask about the behaviors or attitudes of the participants in the group themselves, but to ask what they think others like them think about it. So for example, rather than asking, where do you go for reproductive health care? We would ask, where do young people your age go for reproductive health care? So, I mean, in many cases, they're responding based on their own experience or experience of close friends. But the way that the question is framed allows them to kind of not have ownership over what that response is. Again, still kind of like brainstorming our question structure. Once you have the questions developed, you want to start thinking about the order in which those questions appear. And this is one thing that can be a bit different for focus groups. So it might take the focus group participants a few questions to really kind of get warmed up. So you want to make sure that your key questions aren't the very first ones that you ask, because if you have low responses, a low number of responses, you might really be missing out on some information that might be contributed a little bit later. You also don't really want to save those key questions for the end, right? Because sometimes time management becomes an issue. Sometimes you end up spending a bit more time in a certain section of questions. The participants might be really engaged. You don't want to be rushed at the end and have those be your key questions that you're rushing through. You want to make sure you have enough time to address those. You might also want to think about transitions. So a number of times we have kind of added in just kind of some statements, almost a little bit of a script between sections of questions to let the participants just give them a cue that this is going to feel like a slightly different topic here that we're addressing. And that's totally fine. That helps them kind of understand where it is that we're going. Sequencing is also really important. These are our general guidelines here in terms of order of the questions. So you want to ask general questions before specific. You want to ask positive questions before the negative questions. You'll find that a lot of times people have lots to contribute when they're asked to complain about something. We don't want to kind of like only focus on that. So I recommend asking the positive feedback before the negative. And also no prompt before giving a prompt. So I had this example earlier, right? Thinking about sources of information. So just ask that in an open-ended way, and then you can follow up with specific prompts. If they maybe didn't mention, say, parents as a source of information, you can ask about that specifically. A real common question is, how many questions should there be? There's no one right answer to this. It depends somewhat on your focus and how many prompts you have, how many follow-up questions you have. But you want to keep in mind that your goal is to get a discussion going within the group. And it's not supposed to be really a battery of questions you're asking, but rather a few questions that spark conversation amongst the participants. So again, kind of getting at this how many questions idea, I would say probably 12 questions maximum. 10 is better, maybe something more like 8 would be ideal. But again, you might have specific prompts that follow each of your main questions to help you dig in a little bit more. This next slide here shows, this is an example from one of the resources that we have listed at the end. It's from a book called Focus Groups, A Practical Guide for Applied Research. And this is a sample questioning route. And so this protocol has 10 questions. You can see that there's kind of a general opening question. This serves the purpose of really kind of just getting everyone in the group to say something. So in some ways, it's almost like an icebreaker, but in the context of this focus group. So everyone says their name and how long they've been working with the program. It's something that everyone can have an answer for. It's not, threatening, it's not embarrassing. It's a pretty straightforward thing that just gives everyone the chance to say something. Here they have this kind of broad introductory question, then they transition to getting more specific feedback on the program. So when they first became involved with these services, what were first impressions? What was the startup process like? So they're transitioning, getting the participants to really kind of think about when they first started working with this program and receiving these services. Then questions 5 through 8 are really their key questions. These are the bits of information that they really want to know. And again, you can see questions 5 and 6 illustrate that idea of asking about the positive before the negative. You can also see how questions 7 and 8 are really kind of more specific questions. So again, kind of moving from the general questions in 5 and 6 to the more specific questions in 7 and 8. And then questions 9 and 10 are kind of wrapping things up. The end of question 10 here is something, it's a model that I really like to use. Is there anything that you came wanting to say that you didn't get a chance to say? Or something equally broad and open-ended, kind of bringing home the point that, we're coming to you, to this group of participants for a reason. We want to hear what you have to say about this particular topic or issue. And acknowledging the fact that, maybe we didn't ask all of the most important questions. So just kind of opening it up a little bit. And it also serves as a nice way to kind of wrap up the focus group. So that's kind of some nitty-gritty on developing the questions. So once you have a draft of your questions and the order kind of worked out, you're going to want to really look at a time estimate for each question. How much time do you want to spend on each of these sections? And part of that is, again, thinking about which are your key questions. And ideally, you're going to want to spend the bulk of your time in this group, with this group, focusing on those questions. So if you have allotted 45 minutes for a focus group, you don't want to spend the first half hour going through those introductory questions, right? You want to kind of see what your time goals are. We definitely suggest piloting focus groups. That can really help with timing, but it can also help you revise the questions. So get a group together, even if it's not necessarily the target group that you would want to involve in your specific focus group. You can still get some feedback. And honestly, some of this too is we've had sometimes you don't even realize until you're piloting how similar two questions are, right? And it feels really redundant within the conversation to have both of those questions there. So you kind of go back and revise the questions to really get at what you're most interested there. And maybe you get rid of one of them. But yes, we just really, really recommend piloting these questions to make sure that you're using your time the best way possible and that your participants are really going to understand the questions that you're asking. So we wanted to kind of pause for a moment and think, I think it's really great because we have a number of people here in the workshop with us today who have conducted focus groups. And so we just kind of wanted to pause and ask if you would chat in some things I wish I knew before conducting a focus group. How to control for individual participant bias. So is that kind of like having an individual kind of maybe dominate some of the conversation? Yeah, yeah. One participant driving response and others. Strategies to get things moving if everyone is quiet. How to manage the engagement of all, dominant ones, quiet ones. Great. We are going to talk about some of these issues as well. Great. Okay, so I think feel free to keep adding in there, and hopefully we will address some of these things that you wish you knew. If anyone has guidance on addressing some of these too, given your experience, we would love to hear that. Feel free to chat that in as well. Another comment: transitioning from one question to the next without cutting people off. Yeah, some of that depends. It sounds like we've had some opposite experiences here. Some groups where everyone is quiet and some where it's hard to transition to the next question without cutting people off. So yeah, there's, even within the same focus group project, sometimes you have wildly different groups, right? It's all about kind of the participants within a specific group and the dynamics there. Great. Well, feel free to keep chatting those in as well, and we'll keep trying to address those as we move forward. Okay, so we have developed our questions. We have piloted our questions. The next thing we are going to talk about, okay, there's another comment. I haven't done focus groups before, but would love to know how to course correct if things aren't going as planned. Yeah, we'll kind of talk about that as well. Great, so we're going to jump into recruitment. So a key idea here, of course, I keep coming back to this, is always remember your purpose. You know, why is it that we're doing these focus groups? You want to think about participant characteristics that are important for this particular focus group. So as Jane mentioned, when we did that earlier study looking at adolescent sexual health, we conducted a survey first. We found that surprisingly large number of people indicated that they would go to their doctor's office. We found that kind of surprising. And when we unpacked that further, we discovered that it was really being driven by participants coming from rural areas. And so that led us to say, we need to do a focus group with young people living in rural areas. We need to understand some of these findings a little bit more. So that helped us identify the participant characteristics that we were really interested in. You also want to think about you want to think about your group composition. So you want to bring together people who share that characteristic that's most important for this group. So this similarity should be the basis for your recruitment, and everyone should be aware of that. So for example, if you are doing a focus group with an adult community education program and they want to know how to reach people who are not participating in their services, the defining characteristic would be adults who live in the community and have yet to attend their community education programming. So it's a pretty specific group, and you have to really keep that in mind when you're engaging in recruitment to make sure that you're tapping into the right audience. And I'll give you a wonderful example of a terrible way to do this. So we were working with a group who were interested in youth employment opportunities in the community. And we were asked to help with the focus groups. So we were developing questions and we were going to help with the analysis. Unfortunately, we were not very involved with the recruitment. So we did a handful of focus groups to try to get a broad range of young people in the group or represented in the groups. And we had one focus group that went absolutely nowhere because the questions were all about barriers to young people finding employment, and no one in that particular group wanted a job. So they were entirely the wrong group of people to have in a focus group around this particular question. And the example that I gave for the adult community education program, I could definitely see how that might happen there as well, right? So if you involve adults who have been involved in your community programs, they're not the audience, right? You're not going to hear the perspectives that you want to answer your questions. We have said that the ideal focus group composition is a homogeneous group of strangers. So the idea is that they're kind of homogeneous on this specific characteristic that is really important for your focus group question and purpose. But other than that, they don't know each other. They might have differing perspectives for other reasons, but that they are similar on that important characteristic. So thinking about the size of the group and the number of groups, those are questions that we often get. So size of the group, probably between 6 and 10 people is best. You really, really don't want more than 12 people in a group. And these guidelines are for in-person focus groups. Jane will talk a little bit about differing guidance for doing virtual focus groups. But you want to make sure that you have a large enough group to really generate a rich discussion, but not so large that some participants get left out. So when your group is larger than 12, you might end up having the group kind of fragment, smaller side conversations happening. You run out of time because there's a lot of conversation going on. Smaller groups have their advantages in that it can be easier to manage the conversation. You can dig really deeply into responses, probe even further, but you end up having fewer opinions and ideas shared, but they can be easier to manage. The number of groups, that's another big question. How many do you really need? What kind of representation do you want? What different kinds of views do you want? And again, just being really strategic and thinking about the participant characteristics that you want to have represented in your groups. So for example, we did one large focus group project around adolescent sexual health where we really wanted to hear from different sectors of the youth population. So we did groups with members of the LGBT community. We did groups with HIV positive youth. We did groups with new immigrants, young people living in upstate urban areas, young people living in rural areas. So we really wanted to make sure that we could detect differences between those kinds of characteristics in young people. In the end, it was a lot of focus groups, but again, you want to be kind of mindful about what your purpose is and what kind of representation you want. There's no one answer to that question. So here's a general rule of thumb. There are definitely a lot of those kind of sprinkled throughout that book that I was referencing. There's a lot of kind of general guidelines in there. But you want to plan for about 4 groups with similar audiences, but you can modify as needed. So this idea that you go until you're getting kind of saturation, right? So you continue these groups until you're not really getting very much new information. So we find generally that rule of thumb for 4 groups with a similar audience is sufficient for getting saturation. Again, thinking about what kind of diversity you want to have represented in your focus groups, and what kind of insights are you looking to be able to make. Do you want to say something about young people from across New York State, from New York City? Are you looking at being able to say something about young people from across the US? So once you have really identified the characteristics of who you want to invite to your focus groups, you want to think about the best recruitment strategies. So you want to be really deliberate in your strategy, using nominations from key individuals. So for example, a lot of times we work with youth programs and they may nominate young people to be involved in a focus group. So you can think about if you have partners in the work that you're doing, maybe they have connections to people who would be ideal participants. You can also develop a pool of eligible participants and then randomly select from that group. One way that we have found that really kind of enhances participation, particularly from groups that might be a little bit harder to engage, is to piggyback on another event. And so often we're trying to connect with parents of adolescents or younger children. And so if there's maybe, say, a PTO meeting or an event at the school, perhaps you can piggyback on that event where they're already there, and encourage them to participate in your focus group. Of course, there's lots of more general recruiting strategies, such as ads and flyers and emails and social media. But if you are going that kind of less personal route, you might need to have a broader recruitment approach, to reach more people. You might want to consider using some of the resources of your sponsoring organization. Again, so if you're working with a group that maybe has connections, for example, we work with an organization locally on the study of homeless youth that Jane mentioned earlier. So a lot of times, we will kind of join them for standing meetings that they have with young people. So tapping into those existing resources, existing meetings, things like that. If it's possible to send out personalized invitations, that tends to motivate people to be a little bit more involved. And again, consider incentives if you can. You're asking people to contribute their thoughts and ideas and time to your project, and it's nice to kind of compensate them for that effort. And thinking about incentives, obviously money is one that comes to mind, but it doesn't necessarily have to be money. There are other, money per participant. There are other ways to go. Food is a big incentive, pretty much for everyone. It's kind of across the board. Gift certificates, small gifts can serve as incentives. Sometimes you might actually have kind of a big ticket item that you might raffle off. So not every participant is getting an incentive, but they have the chance to win an iPad or something like that. You also want to think about meeting the needs of your participants. So for example, if you are recruiting parents, is it possible to provide childcare? Something that would really make it possible for them to participate that would otherwise be a limit to their participation. And you really can't, don't downplay having a positive, upbeat invitation, really emphasizing how the ideas that participants share will influence what it is that you're working on. So as Jane mentioned, we do a lot of work with the New York State Department of Health, and we can talk with our participants about how what they share and contribute will directly go to the State Department of Health and can influence policy and funding decisions. I'm just thinking about some of the topics that you all mentioned, possibly doing focus groups on, and I can definitely see how there are likely direct connections between what is generated in a focus group and how that impacts kind of the next steps of what you're doing, right? So people like to know how what it is they're contributing shapes the next step. Okay, so we have invited people, we've decided on our incentives. So actually conducting the focus group. So these are some kind of prior to the focus group things that you'll want to do. Set up very specific meeting times. Make sure that you've blocked enough time, not only for the focus group conversation itself, but a little bit of time before getting started with the questions to build some rapport with the participants. If you're offering food, let them get time to get their sandwich or their fruit salad or whatever it is, and get settled for the focus group conversation. And then allowing enough time on the other side of it so that they're not necessarily rushing right out of there. It's great, of course, to reinforce that this focus group is happening, contacting potential participants by phone or in person prior to the event to recruit, and then also to follow up if they have committed to participating. Making sure that any of those contacts are personalized whenever possible. That definitely helps. Again, keeping in mind your participants and making it easy for them to attend. So think about the times of day or week that they're likely to be more available. So sometimes that's during the evening or during the weekend. If transportation might be a barrier, could you provide funding for transportation? Can you provide transportation? Can you provide childcare or interpreter services? And it's also really helpful to have it be in a familiar place, a familiar public setting. There are definitely some places on Cornell's campus that are very difficult to find, right? Like, don't hold your focus group in a room that's really difficult to find with no parking nearby. Like, that's a great way to encourage very limited participation. So just making it as easy to attend as possible. So kind of anticipating what are barriers for your participants. And again, obviously, of course, all of this is for doing focus groups in person, which hopefully we'll get back to sooner rather than later, fingers crossed. Thinking more about where the focus group will take place. We talked about wanting it to be a convenient location, but you also want it to have a space that feels safe and can be confidential. So we have definitely done a number of focus groups in more public buildings. A library is a great example, but many of them have meeting spaces. So can you hold this focus group in the public library, but in a room where you can close the door, so there aren't so many disruptions and distractions, but it's a really familiar public space. You also really want to think about your room setup. So again, what can you do in terms of just how the seating is organized to encourage conversation? We really recommend this kind of sitting in a circle so everyone can kind of see each other piece. But these are just small things that really have a big impact in how people end up participating.
So I'm going to thank you, Mandy, for all of that rich information. Clearly, as I'm looking at these slides, I mean, this was clearly developed before COVID. I was looking at that circle of chairs going, oh my God, those are way too close to each other. And, this is, we're hoping we'll be able to do in-person focus groups again one of these days. And as we thought about doing virtual focus groups and, in the age of COVID, I mean, actually people have been doing virtual focus groups for quite a few years and have been writing about it. And so I just want to share with you we have not done this yet. I'm about to do a small project next month that I'll be doing virtual focus groups, and I will be able to report back on what that experience is like. But, here we just have listed like some of the pros that I've seen in people who've written about this so far, is that actually doing a virtual focus group can be more inclusive. You could reach people in, all over the country, all over the world. You could do sitting here in Ithaca, New York. You could be tapping into people from, all over different places, and hard to reach populations as well, because it's convenient. Oh, I'm going to go do a focus group. You don't have to move. You don't have to get any place. You don't have to rent a room. You don't have to have refreshments. So it can really be a time saver and a cost saver doing them virtually. Another thing is the anonymity. I mean, Mandy mentioned, how important it is. The ideal focus group is people who don't know each other. But the truth of the matter is, for us, most of the time that we have done focus groups, we're relying upon programs, people who, who find our participants. We have frequently not been the recruiters of the participants. And oftentimes they've been people who know each other. And so they haven't been anonymous. But when you can do virtual focus groups, I think you have much more ability to invite people who have, live in different places, don't know each other. And so to maintain anonymity much more easily. Again, you don't have to have like note takers like you have to have with, we'll be talking about that next, recording information, but you can just have it transcribed easily and recorded. Another pro is that it's potentially more youth friendly, and that youth are more, who operate more in the virtual world. And so that it could be another pro. Would anybody have anything to add that you think could be a pro of having a virtual focus group that you want to chat in? That's not listed here, that could be potentially advantageous for doing a focus group in a virtual environment. Just curious. Everybody's jumping into this. All right. Well, what about the cons? Well, first of all, there's no food, right? That was one of the nice things about bringing young people together. We would bring our teenagers to do focus groups. We'd feed them pizza and then pay them, and they were like, when are you coming back? And they talk about sex, so they just kind of loved doing our focus group projects. But at any rate, what are some of the cons? It limits participants to those who have the technical capacity. So that means, like, if you're interested in the elderly, forget it. It would be kind of difficult to do to have a focus group project with. I won't say what the cutoff age is for elderly. Another con is that you can't really observe up close the body language that the group is giving off, and that's something that's very evident when you're doing an in-person focus group, just like the mood, the feel of the setting. You can't easily assess confusion or lack of understanding, when you have all these kind of little pictures of people on the screen. And you can't sense if someone doesn't understand a question as easily as when you're in person. I also wonder just about the interactivity level. That's so much about when you're even in these Zoom meetings, interrupting is much harder. I wonder if the sort of interactivity is more limited in a virtual focus group. I will be curious about that. I also wonder about sort of managing the group dynamics, if that is more challenging in a virtual environment. So these are all kind of things that I'm thinking about as I kind of get ready for doing a virtual focus group next month. I don't know if anybody has any other cons or pros that they would add to this list. Zoom meetings don't handle multiple voices well. And yes, Joellen, I agree. And much will get cut off. I am concerned. Tara, participants may feel less committed and therefore be a no-show. Oh no, may need to over-recruit, That's a good point. Although we'll have to be doing more, I think, upfront reminders. Are you going to be there? But thank you for that. That's a really good thing. Another idea is participants need to have an appropriate space to take part. That's right. That's right. We're getting to that in the next slide, but absolutely. We have to ensure a quiet spot with no dogs bothering them and phone calls coming in on them, right? Anything else? All right, well, moving in on to the next, here are some tips that I've sort of gleaned from articles that people have written about doing this. So keep that group much smaller than an in-face focus group. I mean, 3 to 6. 3 seems like, it's more manageable on the screen, but that seems a little low. But I'm 4 or 5, 6 at the max. But Mandy was talking about, we've done focus groups with 12 plus, and that gets pretty unwieldy. And then you get a lot of people who don't say anything. You get a lot of dominators in those situations. Use a software that includes video chat and virtual hand raising. And the anticipating technology needs is a big one, and making sure people have access to video conferencing. Here's that important point about having a quiet space, which Layla, you just mentioned in your comment. And make sure that you send information prior to the focus group, which Tara, who you telling us to remind that people might not show up, but to remind people, find a quiet place, make sure your technology is working, and if we could do those technical checks prior to doing the focus group, and being able to test out the software prior to doing it. But there are I'll be very, very curious about what this is going to be like in contrast to an in-person focus group. But doing things in person now seems so foreign that being in the virtual world might feel pretty comfortable. So I will report back after that. Next slide. Yeah, okay. The facilitator is really, really a crucial part of this method, and someone who can be very sensitive and be empathic and listen very, very carefully, and demonstrating respect for the participants, and how much what they are saying is going to be useful, is going to be used, how much we value what they have to say, that there are no right or wrong answers here. A good facilitator really knows the topic well, and is very comfortable with the questions and asking them and the language that's being used, and can really keep their personal views and opinions out of it. And often, ideally having someone that the group can relate to, and that we have broken that one many, many times. I mean, we're talking about all this best practice, and we have committed many, many sins here. I mean, we do a lot with teenagers, and I mean, so it's best to have someone leading the group that's closer in age, not like the middle-aged people that several people on our project are. And so we have broken this one, and we often have our Cornell students lead focus groups with youth. That's been great. And someone who can appropriately manage challenging group dynamics, and that's a very important characteristic of the facilitator. Back to you, Mandy.
So this is really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of conducting the focus group. Obviously, obtaining consent is really kind of a super important first stage. We use this as kind of an opportunity to give an overview of what they can expect, just kind of verbally go over what this is. What is a focus group? What is it that we were hoping to get out of this? And you can include kind of aspects of oral consent right in this kind of introduction and overview. So if you're collecting demographic information, like if you're using a survey or something along those lines, you can also do this kind of right at the beginning of the focus group. So you see pictures here of a couple consent, a consent form and a demographic form that we have used before. So this introduction, as I mentioned, can kind of take the shape of that informed oral consent. You want to introduce yourself. If you have note takers in the room, introduce them and kind of describe their roles. It's great to talk about the purpose of the focus groups. So this is another place to kind of get buy-in and let them know why we're asking these questions and why they, like the participants in this group, why they were specifically invited to participate. And so part of that is understanding how the information from this focus group will be used. We also talk about expectations for the group. So how long the focus group will be, the fact that it's a discussion, so that you as a facilitator have guiding questions, but the goal really is to have participants speak to each other. But part of that is this expectation of respect. So while there are not right or wrong answers to questions, we can expect that people will have different opinions on things. And that's actually great. We want to hear different perspectives and different ideas. So it's fine to disagree with someone and talk about that, but we just want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's respectful. We also use that step up, step back rule. So the idea that if someone has really been speaking quite a bit recently, we might ask them to step back a bit and allow others to kind of add their ideas to the conversation. And if someone has been really quiet for a while, we might ask them to kind of step up and add a little bit more to the conversation. So it's kind of nice to have this set right up from the beginning in terms of expectations, so that if you end up getting to a situation where you need to manage someone who's kind of dominating the conversation, or people who are maybe not contributing so much, you can remind them of, remember how we talked about that step up, step back at the beginning. Just remind them that we had discussed that, and it's a little bit easier to ask them to maybe quiet down for a minute or to speak up. We also let them know, of course, about recording and confidentiality. So we often have a facilitator and 2 note takers when we're doing an in-person focus group. So we let them know if we're doing an audio recording as well. We let them know the purpose of the notes and whether or not their names will be recorded, which generally they never are for our work. We also talk about confidentiality. Here we kind of jokingly refer to this as the Vegas rule. So, you know, that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas slogan. So the idea here is that what happens in this focus group, what's discussed here, stays here. And that's especially important if you are tapping into groups of people who do know each other in other contexts. So really emphasizing that confidentiality is what we do with the information, but it's also what they do with the information. So it's important all the way around. And be sure to answer any questions they have. A number of the documents that you received in advance of this workshop and that are available in that Google folder have some handouts and materials that you could look at as some examples for this. So one of those is the background handout. So we have the version that kind of looks like the consent form, which we always turn into. So there's like the focus group introduction script. So this really kind of looks a lot like what a consent form would look like, but then we always kind of boil it down into a set of points, bullet points that the facilitator can use while actually in the session to cover that important ground. So asking the questions, so finally getting to asking the questions. So it's important that the facilitator is covering all of the questions within the allotted time. So it's helpful to have those time markers. And really to get all participants engaged. So have them all contribute to the conversation, explain their answers. Even though we have a small number of questions, it's helpful to have some probes in mind that can help you dig a little bit deeper. So you might want to have a participant explain a thought or idea in a little bit more depth. So you can use these sorts of phrases. So can you talk about that more? Help me understand what you mean, or could you give me an example of that? So sometimes people kind of want to speak in more general terms, but having these examples or more detail help you really understand what they're getting at. And this is, I think, Jane's favorite part, dealing with challenging participants.
I did put into the chat a book that we have that gets at how to manage dominators, cynics, and wallflowers. So it's by Robert Kahl. It's got a lot of good strategies. But in this one slide, this gives you just a couple of ways of dealing with challenging participants. You know, there's always the sort of experts in the group, and you could say, thank you. What do other people think? Having a dominator is pretty common, and just to sort of take it away from the dominator, you can sort of say, let's have some other comments. What's rough, and I'm thinking about this particularly for the virtual ones, is the rambler, that, you know, the person who just does not stop talking, and that, you know, you can look at your watch, jump in at their inhale, and, you know, just try to get them to stop. But that could be really especially challenging in the virtual one. Having a shy participant, you know, smiling at them, trying to make, you know, eye contact. One, calling on them is possible. I think that one way of dealing with all of this is to if you're not getting responses from other people in the group, and there's either a dominator around, is to say, well, let's do a go around, and let's just take a moment and like have everyone respond to this. So that's another strategy that could help you with the group dynamics, to make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk. And so, as I said, that book that I mentioned really does have a lot of other strategies for dealing with challenging participants, but being able to manage the group dynamics is a really important thing, and that gets easier with time. And so, speaking of time, we have like 10 minutes left here, Mandy. There is a handout in the group around facilitation skills. We've been talking about facilitation skills, and I don't think I want to go into this. You can just read that on your own, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Mandy, for recording and data analysis to finish us up in like 9 minutes.
We do spend quite a bit more time on thinking about, is this the right approach in developing questions and conducting focus groups, because this method differs substantially from other methods, mostly in those realms, right? But recording and data analysis we tend to spend a little less time on, because it's more similar to other qualitative data that you might be working with. And the poll at the beginning, where it says that many of our participants here today have experience with qualitative data analysis, I found very exciting. So I think we'll talk about those quickly. So you want to think through how your responses will be recorded. So I mentioned we also often have note takers in the room. We do usually back that up with an audio recording. We've never really used a video recording, but of course that's a possible feature, especially if you're doing something like this on Zoom, right? You might be recording the Zoom meeting, which would have audio and video potentially. We do have a handout on note-taking tips that you can take a look at. So here's an example of what's in there. So things like making sure the note takers are really familiar with the question, using the script, the focus group script as note-taking template, things like that. You want to think about the level of detail that you want your note takers to capture. One of the things that is important to capture is agreement or disagreement in participant response to a particular item. Again, thinking about why the focus group is such a unique method compared to other methods, right? It's that interactivity. And so it might be really important to know that everyone in the group agreed with a particular statement. There was no disagreement at all. And it might also be interesting to know that the group was totally split on a particular thought or opinion, right? So there were really mixed responses to it. So you want to think about how you're capturing that in your notes. When it comes to data management, again, these are things that we do consider with all of our data. How do you have secure and linked storage between your audio recordings, your notes, your consent, assent, permission forms? What do these look like these days? And that storage, it's important to consider where these things are when you think about your analysis plan and whether you need to have a team accessing this information or an individual. So, I think Cornell definitely has a few data storage, data management systems that it really endorses and feels good about the security of, which actually work really well for teams. So things like using Box for storing files is a good way to go. But thinking about differences between access needs is really important to consider. Data analysis, again, we won't spend very much time on this at all. We could do an entire workshop just on this piece, but you really want your analysis to be purpose-driven, systematic, and it's continuous. So even we often debrief immediately following each focus group. So the facilitators and note takers get together to kind of flesh out notes. If someone missed something, it's a chance to kind of like make sure that we all got everything together. But honestly, that conversation in itself is really a first level data analysis, right? So your data analysis is really continuous. And as long as you're like intentionally documenting that, you can demonstrate the different stages of your data analysis. There's lots of different frameworks that you can use for qualitative data analysis. Constant comparative, individual change. You can look for critical incidents. You can hone in on key concepts. You can test alternatives. But ultimately, I would say that really what you're doing is you're looking for themes. You're looking for patterns to emerge. And again, one of the things that's really interesting with your focus group data, when you look at like the extent to which people in conversation agree or disagree on a particular topic, can help you focus on things that you might want to look at. Unanimously, everyone said this thing. That's pretty interesting. Or if something was a bit more contentious, that's also very interesting. There's lots of different ways to do this. We've done everything. These are just some screenshots of some things that we've done. So everything from coding using an Excel file where we broke out statements. So these are kind of like excerpts from our focus group notes and coding that way. We use deduce quite often. So this is designed as a mixed methods analysis program for social science researchers. Again, totally highly recommend this. It's really, really great for teams who are working on coding projects together. This is an example of their interface, but there's just a lot of ways to get into things here. I like the fact that when you apply codes, you can back up and see the big picture, and you can then also really quickly dive into specific quotes and excerpts. So it's a fun tool, a useful tool for working with qualitative data. If you want to chat in other tools that you have found really useful for qualitative data analysis, that would be great. I think that this sphere is becoming more and more complex and interesting now. But in light of time, I'm just going to kind of keep going through some slides here. But feel free to chat in if you have other tools that you would suggest people check out. We just wanted to share with you a quick example of one way that we presented some focus group findings. So this was around a media campaign designed to reduce consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages among minority male youth. So very specific group. We ended up presenting them with potential media messages. So this is an example kind of flyer or poster, and asking them specific questions about what they're seeing, what stands out to them, what draws your attention, and we would probe for specific aspects things related to color, text size, the amount of text, emotions that it conveys, all sorts of things. In presenting this, we talked about, these are where our groups took place. This is our number of focus groups. We talked about the design features that we addressed in our focus groups and shared some of our key findings here in this really kind of basic but conversation provoking way. So for example, one of the things that came out was that you really want to make sure that your images clearly convey the message you're intending to convey. You want to check the assumptions. This is a really fun example. So here was one potential media message saying a 16-ounce energy drink can have as much sugar as 5 ice cream sandwiches. When I showed this to adolescent minority males, they did not think this was a problem. It was totally fine to eat 5 ice cream sandwiches. So whereas this was supposed to suggest like, whoa, you would never eat that much sugar, and yet you're drinking it in an energy drink, the message totally missed the mark. That was just a really interesting conversation. But so the point being here that there's lots of different ways to present your focus group findings. This is one example that kind of identifies some of the themes and patterns that you then can kind of illustrate with the images or with some of the quotes that came out of the focus groups. There are lots of fun ways to share this information with your stakeholders. But 2:29, we'll stop here. See if anyone has any other questions. And I'm going to just move to the next couple slides because we do have resources here. So this focus group's a practical guide for applied research. This was the book that I had mentioned earlier. There's some more specific pieces looking at developing questions, analyzing. This one's about theory and practice. These are actually links with specific guides. And I think there's a section on, virtual focus groups as well.
So we'll be sending out this PowerPoint to everybody following this presentation, but and here's our contact information, and feel free to contact us with questions. I know we didn't have time today to answer your questions, but if you have questions, you need some support, more resources, any questions at all, this is how you can contact us. And there's our website. And yeah, I think that it's 2:30.
So yeah, it's 2:30. For people who have a few questions and you want to stick around, Jane and Mandy, are you okay being here for another 5 minutes or so?
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know friends, well, before that, let me just quickly say for those of you who need to leave now, thank you so much for your time. We do have 2 more upcoming how to do research in real world setting workshops. One on March 11th is how to mitigate threats to your digital privacy. And in April, we'll have one on how to transform your research into riveting stories that people remember. So thank you very much. For those of you who want to stick around and ask questions, I see that there's at least one from Francesca here in the chat box. Mandy, I'm not sure if you see that one, but you want to address that?
Yeah, so the question was, do you ever share or check findings with participants themselves? Yes, we definitely do. There's often a very iterative process. So the focus group project that I was just sharing some findings on related to the sugar sweetened beverages, that was actually, we had 2 series of focus groups. And so part of it was kind of taking the feedback obtained from the first set to revise, design different media messages. And then we talked with not necessarily the exact same participants. In some cases, it was the same participants, but we had a mix of new and returning, but shared back what we heard in the first round and discussed how that influenced what we were doing in the second round. We also, particularly that focus group project comes to mind as well, that we really did share information back with the sites. So we sent them, quick summaries of what we learned there. And we also, so this actually yielded a media campaign. And so we sent them the results of that. So they received like hard copies of the posters, and there were some video messages created as well, so we certainly sent them that information. But yeah, I think that's actually a really rewarding thing for participants too, to again, kind of see what it is that you did with the information they shared. Oh, good. Great. I'm glad that's helpful.
Hmm.
Question. So we often hear the message that we are more divided than ever. Have you seen this play out in your focus groups? I can imagine that that is really relevant to the topic at hand. I think a lot of, and Jane, feel free to jump in here too, but some of this, I hope we kind of address when we set expectations with the group. So we have the expectation that not everyone is going to agree or have the same perspective, but that we need to address that in a really respectful way.
Yeah, I think that, Joellen, if we were doing something about politics, that this would be, super concern. But, health, I'm going to be doing one about death. I don't foresee it playing out on topics of health and wellness as much as sort of politics, values.
I hope that it continues. But I've been having conversations with people that, how did that get political?
Okay,
It
interesting.
feels like it shouldn't have.
Right, like wearing a mask. Why should that have become political?
Right, exactly. That's an excellent example.
Yeah, I hope not. I mean, but it's something to be mindful of, and as Mandy said, to really address things up front when you're setting your ground rules and being respectful, and it's a challenge.
And you gave some examples that I think would help.
Good.
Yeah, and I think that the approach to facilitation can also help with that a bit, right? So this idea that we acknowledge all ideas equally, that we're not demonstrating like, oh, that's a great idea, and so that you're
neutral, being neutral.
Yeah, so that's something that sometimes is really hard to do, but because we're all people too, right? But I think once the participants feel that all of their opinions are going to be equally valued by the people asking the questions, I think that that can help too.
All right.
Are there more questions? I guess I don't see any.
I think that's...
All right, well, let's call it a wrap. Jane and Mandy, thank you so much again. It was great. And for those of you who stayed for the Q&A, thank you for staying for the Q&A. We hope you'll come back to future how-tos and check out our Talks at 12 series too. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.